I'd like to begin actually with a little bit of stillness and a bit of a sort of meditation. So I'm going to invite you to make sure you're sitting comfortably. And let's just connect to our capacity to hear, and just be aware of what you can hear in this space. And then with that same level of sort of concentration and focus, just inviting you to bring your awareness inside. And you can soften your gaze or close your eyes. And we're just going to spend a couple of moments connecting with our bodies and just coming into a bit of a stillness and a transition into this evening. And so let's just begin by connecting with the cycle of our breath. So just feeling that exhalation and that expelling of air, and the inhalation, the bringing in of new life, new energy, constantly cycling. And perhaps just by bringing your awareness to your breath, you notice that it wants to shift a little bit on its own. Perhaps that inhalation wants to linger for a moment. Or there's a little sigh on the exhalation. And you can notice if it feels uncomfortable to be still, or to be so aware of what's going on in your inner world, or perhaps it feels like a relief, or something else entirely. So just noticing, how is it to be still? And continuing with this theme of cycling, perhaps bringing your awareness down into your pelvis, into your womb or womb space. Knowing that you have this cyclical blueprint encoded into your body. What's your relationship to that? And again, perhaps there's some kind of direct feeling or connection or some form of relationship. Perhaps that's something completely new. Perhaps it's really difficult to connect with the idea of a womb that is cycling, and that's okay too. And then just finally, let's bring our awareness, still with closed eyes, into the space and out into beyond this space as we connect with the seasonal cycle. feeling the darkness outside, the cold, the sense of moving into perhaps more introverted times, or that's nature's invitation, the slowing down, and just noticing what's my relationship to that. And then let's just take a couple of deeper breaths to bring ourselves back. So, just a couple of minutes just to share about what is it like to connect with womb cycles, seasonal cycles, or any kind of cycles, and why does that bring me here? So just a couple of minutes per person, just to sort of take a moment to connect. So I'm really curious just to hear a little bit from you, because then I know who's here and I can sort of tailor what I'm going to say accordingly. I'm really curious what your relationship is to cycles or living cyclically, and what sort of what brings you here, and just to hear a few voices would be lovely.
I feel quite well connected to nature's cycles, but very ill connected to my own body cycles. I basically just have no idea about hormonally what's going on as the month passes. Therefore never express any compassion for myself and what difference that might make.
Okay. Thank you.
Whereas the cycles of nature feel more visible to me. So I can actually see what's going on. I can feel it on the skin.
Great. Anyone else?
I actually felt slightly opposite, I guess. I just felt really connected to my cycle because of in the last year when I had to, it was very all over the place, like a year and a half ago. But almost now that I am connected and I'm very aware at what point in the month I am and what that means to my body, I still feel quite a sort of frustration towards it sometimes. Even though I know, I'm feeling like that at that point because of the hormone levels and understanding a little bit more of the release of this, but I still feel kind of a slight disconnection in that way with us of not full acceptance around it.
Cool, thank you.
I don't feel connected to my cycle at all. I don't know anything about it, which I think is quite interesting. And then maybe a sort of subconscious projection of it, of that kind of, I don't know, being a woman. I think for me personally, there's a bit of like I don't know. I don't know what it is. Yeah, very disconnected. Very disconnected.
Thank you.
I used to track my cycle when I was really, really young. And it was like a sort of like a self-care, kind of knowing what's going on with your body. And then with the years, just stopped doing that. And like just recently, I kind of noticed like how different I am, and like on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, and connect that into my cycle. And so I want to kind of get into tune with my body and more, and again kind of start doing things like that as like a self-care kind of when you
Nice, thank you.
I've been like tracking my period for a while now, so I feel quite connected to know what's happening like with that. I think it's still want to kind of love the premenstrual week more than kind of the menstruation week, because it does feel like the first 2 weeks are great and then it's the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And if this is happening every month, it's kind of like about trying to kind of love that as well.
Yeah.
But, it's really
I think that's my intention for this evening, that by the end of the evening everyone's going to be totally in love with your cycle. Because that really has been the path for me, is learning how to be in this really dynamic love relationship with it. And, you know, it feels, you know, when I tell people that, oh, I teach menstruality or menstrual cycle awareness and I'm interested in the bridge between that and activism, and they're like, oh, that's nice, isn't it? It just feels like so sort of niche and a bit obscure. But I think the reason that I'm into it is that the implications are so massive. And considering that half the population has a womb, and we are living for the most part totally disconnected from it, and considering how it's not just the womb that's cycling, but there seems to be this sort of foundational blueprint of life that is cyclical, no? Like everything around us is cycling, yet we're just living in total disregard for that. So what would life be like if we were really connected to inner cycles and how everything is cycling? So that's what I want to dive into with everyone this evening. And maybe I just explain how I sort of got into this topic. As I was introduced, my background is more working with sexuality and human relating. And I was never into the sort of physiology and the nitty-gritty of sex. I was never a sort of sex geek. I didn't have enough sex to be a sex geek. But I was fascinated in sexuality as a gateway into all the important things in life somehow. What is my relationship to my body? Who am I beyond my body? What is my relationship to leading and to surrendering and shame and all of these different topics? And I became really interested in one particular dynamic a few years ago, and it was this question of, if I'm leading an erotic encounter with someone, is there such a thing as a sort of feminine way to lead? Because I saw sort of, you know, that we have this sort of stereotypical female sexual leadership as this sort of dominatrix. And I sort of tried that out a little bit, and I just thought, no, it's not me. Like, but then what is my way of leading? And what is there such a thing as a feminine way? Beyond a sexual encounter, just in general, what is feminine leadership? And then I thought, well, instead of listening to someone's theory or reading a book about it, what if one way of researching that could be studying the body? And I know that not everyone who has a female body identifies as female, but you know, maybe there's something in it. If you study the womb, that it can tell you something about the womb. And so I did. And I was apprenticed by my own womb through the Red School, which is an amazing school, and I'm very grateful for their guidance. They've written a wonderful book called Wild Power, which is my top recommendation if you want to sort of go a little bit deeper with this work. So that just catalyzed a extraordinary journey into myself, which is ongoing and never ending, and why I'm sitting here. And yeah, my other work is sort of really focusing on the body and politics. I believe that we are sitting with a massive elephant in the room, which is the role that trauma plays in our lives and the sort of disconnect that we have from our bodies. And I think the world would be a radically different place if, instead of thinking of I have a body, that we say I am a body. That difference, I think, would just make the world radically different, and I think a much better place as well. So, I've called this talk the sort of embodied activism of cyclical living. And yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about what embodied activism is to me, and then we'll dive into the cyclical living part and look at womb cycles, but also lots of different kinds of cycles, but probably focusing quite a bit on womb cycles. I imagine that's why lots of you are here as well, because you have an interest in that. So, embodied activism, I don't think there is a proper definition. I think it's a bit of a new term, to be honest. I think it sort of popped up some years ago, and so my sort of definition is my personal one, and I'm sure there are others. But for me, this term, it really rests on the idea that for excellent leadership and the way that we show up in the world, to have the sort of maximum positive impact, we need to embark on this twin trail. And I think it was like a First Nation chief who first used this term. I think it's really beautiful. It's the idea that we need to take this path within in order to really understand ourselves, in order to really connect, in order to do the integration work, the shadow work, the sort of healing work. And we need to do this in order to take the path, the trail out, and show up as powerful agents in the world. And we need to have both of these. And the word embodied activism for me also, it supports this sort of shift in how we think of activism and how we think that change happens in the world. So I think that this sort of old model is that change requires force, and the more force you have, the more change happens. And perhaps there is a truth to that, but it's kind of a partial truth, because change also happens from the ground up. And change also happens in ways that are far more mysterious than we can comprehend, right? Because if everything is like interconnected, which quantum physics is now able to sort of prove, even though we've known it for a long time, but how I show up in the world and the little micro choices that I make every day have an impact. And so what we're doing with this sort of cyclical living, learning how to be more in tune with our internal rhythms, we are embodying balance, and we are radiating balance out into the world. And oh my goodness, doesn't the world need more balance? And so if you look at this sort of inner and outer trail, which you could call a sort of yin and a yang way of engaging with life, with ourselves, there's a big similarity to a sort of archetypal cycle, if you will, because the cycle teaches us, as an imprint of sort of wholeness, that there is a time for sort of emerging and coming out into the world and action and yang, and there is a time for, like nature is doing now, becoming more internal, slowing down, shedding, letting go, coming into winter or death. And as I said, this seems to be like a sort of blueprint of life, that we have life and death cycles in all life forms around Earth. We have the sun, Earth cycling around the sun, we have the moon cycling around the Earth, we have our womb cycles, and we have so many other kind of cycles which we'll perhaps brainstorm a little bit later. But I'd like to sort of hone in a little bit on womb cycles, and get a bit geeky with you. But I'm not going to get too much into the sort of science and physiology, because I have this weird thing where I can only remember things if they really directly apply to me. So I cannot remember abstract scientific knowledge. It just doesn't happen. But there's so much information online or in books, so you can do further research. But I want to describe to you the amazing phenomena that is happening within our bodies. And you can find a list, actually, of all the sort of physiological, and not just physiological, on all levels, changes that are happening every single day as someone with a womb that's cycling. it would take me like 5 minutes to read it out to you if I were to read all the changes that are happening within us. It's unbelievable. And then you think, wow, like we're just living completely oblivious to that. So there's a lot going on, a lot of different changes. And of course, if our life isn't designed cyclically, if there's no culture around it, if we're disconnected from our bodies, we can go our whole lives without really noticing. So let's have a look at what happens in a sort of womb cycle. So the sort of bits that we're familiar with, most of us, is that we have these kind of two poles you could imagine in a womb cycle. You have menstruation and you have ovulation. And one way of looking at it, of course, you know, we have different levels of hormones that are secreted that make these things happen. Interplay between estrogen and progesterone for the most part. But you can also look at it in terms of a sort of energy flow a little bit. And I think that some of us here might notice that we feel different when we ovulate compared to when we menstruate, energy level wise, right? And so one way of looking at it, and an interesting way that you can experiment with, is that between menstruation and ovulation, it's like we're riding a current of yang out into the world. It's this sort of wave of energy that is sort of propelling us into the world. We have energy to act, we have energy to get stuff done, we have a sort of extroverted, this is me, here I am, I can make shit happen. I can literally feel it from one day to the next. I will wake up, I will sort of go to bed feeling quite energized and a general sort of yes for life. And then I will wake up in the morning and it's just like, oh no. It's really remarkable from one day to the next. And of course that no is also a little bit, you know, it's a no to the world perhaps, but it's a yes to ourselves, because our focus can become more internal, more introverted. And I think it's really important when I say whatever I'm saying, that you see it as a sort of archetypal cycle. And the most important thing, and this is what I'm going to come back to after describing this sort of archetypal cycle, is doesn't matter what anyone says, it matters how you experience it for yourself. That is the power of this work. It's like reclaiming our ability to really feel ourselves and to respond to what's going on and not listen to what other people say, and not have this top-down approach of like, you know, this is how I should feel, or I don't want to feel this, but it's a real sort of inner cultivating a sensitivity. And we'll look at why that is so powerful in the world and the sort of activist qualities of that in a bit. So yeah, whatever I say, just know that it's sort of, it can be helpful to know a little bit about an archetypal cycle, but it can also get in the way if you realise that you should be feeling something and you're feeling something different. So yeah, maybe you've heard of the sort of seasons of a cycle. Has anyone heard the cycle being described as sort of spring, summer, autumn, winter? Yeah. So I think it was the Red School that made that sort of bigger. It's a bit Eurocentric because not everyone has seasons like we do. But you can also think of it, you know, these two currents with these two poles, that there's different stages, and one way is seasons and one way is perhaps the stages of a plant. So that as we move from menstruation towards ovulation, it's like a little baby plant that's slowly sort of unfurling and then starting to blossom in full glory around ovulation, and then starting to sort of wilt a little bit, or maybe harvest some berries, and then sort of decay into the ground again in menstruation and winter. And the sort of depth to which we can feel what happens in those different stages, day by day, feels like it's infinite. So when I first started cycle tracking, I put it off for months. I did this training and I was meant to do cycle tracking and I just couldn't do it. I always had a reason why I shouldn't do it. And cycle tracking is basically writing down a sentence every day how you feel, depending on where you are in your cycle. So that was my one thing that I had to do, and I just couldn't do it. And so my teacher sat me down and said, you know, what's up? And so I started unpacking, why do I have so much resistance to doing this? And the reason I had so much resistance is because it just seemed absurd to me, like the idea that something was changing from the inside. It's like I'm so bombarded with like stimulation and stuff happening and just dealing with it. I can't feel the micro, tiny little changes that are happening one day to the next. That's crazy. And she said, well, just try. And once you start, something inside you is activated and it becomes easier. And it did. And it takes a while, but our ability to really feel those subtle changes is amazing. I'm just feeling into what to share. Do I? So a lot of people just have symptoms, right? Like the idea that you would enjoy your cycle seems a bit, an interesting perspective, but a little bit unattainable. And I think that one of the things that starts happening when we start listening to what our cycle is telling us is that we realize that it's not just the way it is that we struggle and have pain or PMT, someone was talking about. It's not just a sort of matter of fact and something that we have to deal with, but it's our body speaking to us and saying that something needs addressing. And that, of course, is quite a different way of relating to ourselves than our culture would usually have us do, right? Because usually we have this sort of top-down relationship and we want to take a pill and just cover it up, or take the contraceptive pill, or, you know, something's wrong, just try and fix it instead of sort of listening. And what it feels like starts happening when we start listening is that our cycle really takes us on a journey into what our body is trying to tell us and what you need in order to really come into thriving. What do you need in order to really feel like you live a life of integrity, to feel like you're really in your potential? Like your cycle, once you start listening to what it's trying to tell you in terms of symptoms, but also anything that is going to grab your attention, it's like an ongoing therapy or self-development, or just maybe I should give you examples. Are you with me? Yes? I felt like I lost you for a second. So, from being in a community of women who are doing cycle tracking, I've noticed a pattern that happens a lot. And the pattern is usually that we realise that the days before menstruation are tough, and that we have a tendency to be irritable and sensitive, and angry and overwhelmed, and so we start going, well, why is that happening? What's going on? And then we go, okay, so this part of my cycle, actually, if I really feel what's going on, I can feel like my body's actually wanting to slow down, and I'm actually becoming more sensitive. And I can feel how my awareness is sort of shifting, and rather than everything being all like rosy and full of possibilities like it is pre-ovulation, in this part of my cycle I notice that I'm a bit more critical. Like my awareness just sort of shifts, and these things put together, if I just continue as I'm going about the rest of my cycle, and I'm just really busy, and I'm going through my to-do lists, and I'm just tackling life as I have been, and I'm not taking time to rest more, and I'm not taking time to slow down, and I'm not sort of being aware of what my sensitivity really requires, then I don't feel good. And so there's this sort of in-depth examination that happens around this time of our cycle, and wow, what is my relationship to slowing down? What is my relationship to like appreciating my sensitivity? A lot of unpacking on that topic, and a lot of realizing about how we live a life and have a culture around us that is all about that first half of the cycle. That it's all about having goals and being productive and getting shit done and being a bit kind of an impenetrable force in the world. And as soon as we tip into something else, which is the second half of our cycle, and for many of us it's the sort of longer half of our cycle, we head into a very different kind of territory, and it involves many different sort of qualities that our culture does not recognize or value in any way. And they're all superpowers. And so part of learning how to love our cycle is about learning how to really feel those qualities as superpowers, and learning how to sort of really take care of ourselves, and ask ourselves what we need in the different parts of our cycle. Any questions until I can keep going, but I just want to break it up a bit. Yes.
How long were you tracking for?
Like good girl tracking, writing down on paper? Maybe like 9 months.
Wow, that's pretty good.
I mean, like, I missed a few days. But now I'm such a geek that, like, everything I feel or experience during the day, I'm relating it to where I am in my cycle. And because it's my work, it's easy. But it involves such a sort of cultural shift, that you have to surround yourself by other people who are doing it. Otherwise, I think it's impossible or really difficult. Yeah.
Can you speak a bit about the relationship of our cycle to the lunar cycle, and maybe particularly what happens if they're really not aligned?
Okay. I'm not an expert, to be honest. So if you think of menstruation being the sort of wintry time, it just makes sense that it would correspond with the new moon. And you know, that first day after the new moon is the sort of first day of the new cycle, and ovulation would be more sort of the full moon. You know, there's no scientific research that says that moon cycles affect menstrual cycles. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. I know that a lot of women do have their cycle sync with the moon, and I know I've been told that if you menstruate on a full moon, that life is really supporting you to sort of connect very deeply within and then take that insight and sort of express it out into the world. It's kind of like having support to have an extroverted bleed. And on a new moon, it might sort of really intensify this feeling of being very kind of internal and quiet and the sort of idea that the average cycle is actually, there was research that was published the other day, it's actually 29 and a half days, so it's slightly longer than a moon cycle, and it's just the average, so there's not that many people who have a cycle that's exactly that long, and they do sort of jump around. I wonder if we lived in a place where we were exposed to moonlight and no artificial light, I would imagine that our cycles would become much more regular and they might sync with the moon. But yeah, I don't know.
And then also on that topic, and because of the irregularities,
Mm-hmm.
so what do irregularities tell us? Like, why would I suddenly be late for a week? What do I have to look in my life? Like, what is going on? And why am I peaking with energy just before my period suddenly?
I wish there was an easy answer. I would love to know. And I really invite you, if that's something that's happening to you, to really start listening and going on an inquiry as to why that might be, because it will be a rich inquiry. I'm sure it will lead you to some interesting realizations. And I think, it can have to do with lots of things. It can have to also do with things that potentially happened, I've heard, 3 months ago, that if you have something very stressful that happens, and stress can impact your hormone levels and your ovulation and everything, and then 3 months later you can notice the sort of consequences of that. I always feel like it's like I choose to believe that there's an intelligence to it, and that when it happens to me, I'm trying to find the gold in it, and there's always some kind of gold. But I wonder also, just with the lives that we lead that are so disconnected from nature and the seasons and everything, that it might well have an impact on the regularity of our cycle.
One thing I will say, which is interesting when you say disconnected to nature, if I fly, I know that my cycle gets irregular since I'm a teenager.
I was about to ask
It's just like,
Yeah.
that just kills the whole cycle every time I fly, which is connected to like something not natural.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
I can add to that just in terms of your cycle. I was literally just having this conversation with my friend Jane. I have herniated disc in my back, and when I get a flare up, my cycle always shortens. Because she knows that I'm trying to take care of my back. So my cycle this week is literally 1-2 days. My bleed.
Cycle.
Oh, you mean your bleed?
bleed,
Okay, yeah.
Compared to like 4 or 5,
Okay.
it will always shorten when I have a flare up, because she can feel that there's so much energy trying to contain and heal already, that if I'm bleeding really powerfully, I'm just exhausted.
Yeah.
So definitely in that sense, if you tune in and like ask for help, she won't, for me anyway, like she's not gonna tire you out if you need nourishment.
Traveling and being sick definitely affects cycle. Can make it shorter or longer.
Anything else? Yes.
Can you talk about what you mean by lucid?
Listening to our body.
Or just
Yeah.
lucid
So I would mean just paying attention and noticing on a physical level what I notice in my body, as in, can I feel my womb? Does it feel heavy? Does it feel light? Does it feel like it's sort of radiating outwards? Does it feel like it's drawing inwards? Does it feel pain? Does it feel juicy? Does it feel flirty? Does it, then noticing energy-wise, do I feel like my energy wants to sort of move out in the world, or do I feel like my energy wants to sort of come inside? And when I bleed, and I'm sure it's different for everyone, but for a lot of us, when we bleed, it really feels like our awareness, if it's allowed to do what it wants to do, it just wants to like really rest inside. Noticing what my emotional body is doing. So do I feel connected to my emotions? Do I feel introverted or extroverted? Do I feel like I want to connect with people, or do I feel like I want to sort of be for myself? Do I feel like I want to do things at a fast pace and get things done? Do I feel like I want to slow down? So it's just, I guess when I say listen, it just means like noticing on all the different levels that make me me. Inbar, can you think of any other things that you track? This is one of my cycle trackers over here. Examples of what you track. Oh, I'm sorry.
I like the temperature going higher just after ovulation.
Temperature?
Yes, so you can then predict sort of when you're going to have the time where you maybe, like, as you said, more introvert and not necessarily like keep like going on like next
Mm-hmm.
in mood. Say I don't plan too many things just before my period, because I know that as you said, that I need to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
So the temperature helps me also, like you can also you can also
Battery settings.
I know, but it's changing, and it's either like very soft or hard, and if you keep doing that on a daily basis, you will notice the difference. Like on the beginning, it can be like difficult. It's like, I guess it's like using mooncap in the beginning. You like, oh, you have to get used to kind of. Okay, this is soft, this is hard, and then all those symptoms can give you more information.
And the fluids change as well.
Fluid, oh yeah. I mean, it's like an egg white kind of.
And so a lot of people use this for fertility tracking. So you can actually use, this sort of indicators of know exactly when you ovulate and then not have unprotected sex, or have unprotected sex around that time, depending on whether you want to get pregnant or not.
What you want.
Yeah. Yes.
So I was just going to ask, how does like birth control, so the pill or coil, kind of affect our cycles? Are we still kind of in tune with it, or is it numbing us?
Yeah.
Would you say we recommend it? Is it disconnecting us from our
So the very simple answer is, with the contraceptive pill, you do not have a cycle.
Yeah.
It's completely taking it away.
Yeah. So I have a coil as well, and I don't have periods now, but I still feel the.
Yeah. I think it's different. Like the coil, I feel like my understanding is that it's a very minute amount of hormones that are secreted, so it's not exactly like the pill, but you won't have a normal cycle, and if you want to really experience yourself cycling, you'd have to sort of go without it. Yeah.
Is there a way you I take the conceptual, but is there a way you can connect with your still what's going on day to day, like you say, with all the small changes that happen inside, or is it just completely artificial? Really?
You can connect with moon cycles and seasonal cycles and other kinds of cycles, but the contraceptive pill really does take it away.
There is like a psychological cycling element to it though, that because men have hormonal cycles too, they just don't bleed. So there is a way to connect to something, but not.
I was about to actually ask this question, like about what's happened with the men. Do they have this? So they have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not the
And how are the
same.
trans women
Not
who?
the same, but they do have.
There are testosterone cycles, and there might be other kinds of hormonal cycles that we don't really have the research around. But yeah.
How about trans women on the hormonal therapy? When they, I guess that can be.
Well, I mean, it's
For trans
fascinating.
people,
I
yeah.
have a friend, sort of a peer, that was born male and identifies now as female, who then took estrogen.
Yes.
Fascinating what they reported after taking estrogen. It's feeling much more empathy and compassion, much more able to cry.
So interesting.
Yeah, really, really interesting.
I'd
but-
imagine they're just touching on the contraception thing. If people, I'm not on anything, but when I have been on any form of contraception, it's been a copper coil, and copper actually doesn't affect your cycle. It just,
But
yeah,
there are two
with no
types
hormones, it actually
of-
just it deactivates the sperm's tails, so they can't penetrate the egg.
But nowadays you can have one with a copper and one
You can have
that
a
release
ball,
hormones
someone with a
also.
ball as well.
Yeah,
So there are a couple of different.
It's less
depend-
abrasive.
it's less painful when you actually do bleed. It
Okay.
doesn't
Well,
affect your bleed though.
do you know which kind of is this hormonal one or the one with the copper, as you said?
Yeah, copper doesn't
Yeah.
have.
hormonal if it stops your period.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
the
that's
copper one would stop the period. That would be hormonal.
It actually makes your period slightly stronger.
Yeah. Yeah, I really want to go back to this, the reality that so many of us have painful periods and feel sort of varying degrees of distress in the lead up towards our period. And that we've been given this idea that that's just what it involves, no? That we just have to put up with it, and that's what being a woman involves. And I just really want to transmit that it doesn't have to be that way. And that the more we start sort of noticing how we're changing and how our needs change, the more we can start deriving real pleasure from our cycle, and the more we can start using our cycle also to our advantage. And there's so many ways you can use your cycle to your advantage. So I'm just going to go a little bit into that, and then we'll look more at the sort of bigger picture and what does this actually mean for the world if we were all living cyclically. Could I have a glass of water? Is that right? Thank you. So, using your cycle to your advantage. So if you have different skills that are refined in certain parts of your cycle and certain things that you struggle with that you might not just find such an ease and flow with. You can totally if you have some freedom, you can use certain times for certain things, such as did you know that your bleed is actually an amazing time to sort of vision and daydream and sort of take a sort of bigger look at the bigger picture? It's also an amazing time to ask for guidance or take a question in that you're kind of inquiring into, and sort of connect with a deeper part of yourself or the earth or something else and ask for guidance. Or that in those days after your bleed, as you move towards ovulation, is an amazing time for generating ideas and brainstorming and sort of looking at life through this lens of potential. So if you want to vision something that you want to bring into the world, your springtime, so those days sort of between menstruation and ovulation, is an amazing time for sort of generating ideas and getting excited and sort of testing things out. And then of course most of the research done on cycle awareness is around the days of ovulation, and so there's quite a lot of research to show how our social habits change around that time, and also how sort of daring we are. So we're much more, science says, much more likely to be sort of adventurous and risk-taking. So it's a good time around your ovulation, archetypally speaking. Of course you have to see for yourselves, but to do something that requires boldness and confidence, that requires a lot of energy, stamina, expression. And then, say in your autumn, as you move past ovulation more towards your menstruation, it's an amazing time for your inner critic to come out in a positive way. So that part of you that wants to sort of look at a project and see what's working and what's not working, or look in your life within yourself, what's in integrity, what's not in integrity. There's something around when progesterone is increased as we move towards menstruation, is this fascinating thing happens, which is that our ability to sort of perceive the bullshit around us and what's not in integrity, what's sort of in the unconscious or between the lines, that ability is enhanced. It's amazing. But of course that inner critic is a sort of double-edged sword, because if we have a sort of self-destructive tendency or a sort of low self-esteem, or we can direct that inner critic towards ourselves, but it's a superpower. It's Kali's sword that says what's truth and what's not truth, what's okay and what's not okay. And of course, if we start having more access to our emotional world, as this phase is famous for, you could see that as a weakness, which in our world, emotions culturally are seen as a weakness. But I think that we're understanding more and more how ill it makes us to see emotions as weakness, and how necessary it is to allow ourselves to really be touched by the world. And I'll go into that a little bit more later, sort of activism of grief and why emotions are so important. But just to give you this idea that it can really be a superpower to harness this time where we're able to feel emotions more. So hopefully that gives you an idea as to how you can use your cycle in terms of what your superpowers are. Also use your cycle to look at where you struggle, to start unpacking that and let your body guide you into what's going on. to ask the question, like, what is it that I'm needing that I'm not receiving? What is it that's not in balance in my life? What is it in my lifestyle, what I'm eating, how I'm spending my time? What is it that's like not in integrity, that's not serving me, and therefore my body is giving me a sign? Yes.
So like, just because I'm pretty much in mode at the minute, and just thought about something then. Like, so for example, this month, so things that have happened in my family, like family members that have annoyed me, perhaps early in the month. Like yesterday and the day before, I was like, all of the stuff that I thought I was okay with was kind of like rising to the surface, and I was just getting really annoyed by them, even though I hadn't even spoken to them. But all of the things they've done were like just in my mind, and I can see what you're saying. Then it kind of brings to your mind what your kind of your critic, I suppose, and what you're thinking, what in your life that's annoying you or frustrating in that kind of thing. But I think what I tend to do then is just feel the annoyance and just be annoyed that I'm annoyed by them, rather than like seeing it as like they're annoying me kind of thing.
Say that bit again.
Like, I kind of tend to see it as like it's me.
There's something wrong with me.
Yeah, and then also it's like, because I'm now aware that this is also PMT kind of thing, I kind of don't make any chain react on it, because I think,
Right.
oh, it's just me being over the top.
Yeah.
And then by the time you've menstruated, you're feeling good again. So actually those things, you
Yeah.
kind of think, oh, I don't care about that anymore.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's hard to kind of...
I know exactly what to say, because I know exactly the same thing. And it's like the same, like today even, like I've been actually arguing with my partner about the mess in the house. He likes and it's like close to ovulation, that doesn't bother me that much. It bothers me, but like I can be more negotiable about this.
I think you have to. No one can discern it for you. You have to. Everyone has to discern for themselves. Like, when am I just being sort of irritable and I'm just sensitive, and when is there something that's really not okay, and I need to trust the fact that I'm having an emotional response. So that's some kind of internal compass that wants to reveal something to me, and I need to pay attention to it and make some changes or address something. Yeah.
It's really interesting actually, because you kind of link periods on that, it's just like, it undermines you, almost undermines your emotions, you brush under the carpet, like you're entirely hormonal,
Yes.
It almost undermines us as women. And actually what we're saying is, actually it's like, could be doing something very different, illuminating, casting light on the things that actually aren't right about life, and maybe it's not just you, maybe it's
Exactly.
everything, maybe it's actually us connecting to somebody. That's really interesting.
And this is one of the really like empowering and sort of could create a massive cultural shift if we're so attuned to ourselves and we're listening to our bodies and we're noticing, like, when do I feel a sense of thriving and when do I just feel irritable or flat or low. You know, we have to address the fact that we have needs, and are our needs being met? And what are the ways in which, like, we are, you know, finding pseudo ways of meeting our needs, you know, that we're so surrounded by, you know, junk food and Netflix and going to the pub and, you know, all these things we think we can do to help us feel better, but actually the more attuned we are, the more we have to ask ourselves, what do I actually need in order to really feel good, and am I living that life, and what do I need to change? And, you know, the way that our culture is made up is that we don't ask those questions, that we don't address what our needs are, because if we really did address what our needs are, we would be living in a very different world. We just wouldn't put up with it. We would not put up with it. We would not put up with working 9-to-5 jobs 5 days a week in this perpetual productive summer mode. We wouldn't put up with it. No. Yes.
It's also how mental health services are structured as well. The whole notion of recovery, it just really just feels quite linear. There isn't that acceptance of cyclical stuff, and it's like getting straight back into being productive and meaningful activity and all that stuff. And
mental health crises. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. I mean, I know
I
that.
don't know what I'm asking.
Okay.
It's just having just come out of a mental health crisis where my cycle was completely absent for months.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
now coming back into that, having gone through being an inpatient, going to the day unit and coming out of that back into the community, when you go through all of those processes, there's an element of like, this is how we recover, and it's got nothing to do with being cyclical. It's all about engaging with meaningful activity and stuff like that. And it's just like, when you have a whole industry that is dealing with vulnerable people, why? Just why? Yeah.
I had like really the most terrible period pains every month. Wasn't in tune with my cycle at all. In pain, just took ibuprofen, all the things for like years. And then I had really stressful anxiety, all the things. And then had like a big mental breakdown, and then had to completely turn my life around and change my entire lifestyle and stop working for a long time, and suddenly I haven't had period pains. I don't get period pain. I haven't had period pains for a year and a half.
Amazing.
I track my cycle. I really listen to it. I so like appreciate the days before my cycle because I know what that means. I so look forward to the time to be quiet, and it's like, oh my god, changing my relationship with that has been such a massive part of like my recovery and my journey into this
Amazing.
stability, happiness.
Yeah.
But also like to mention to your like mental health and crisis, like very often actually doctors try to medicate PMS with antidepressants. So they just kind of like, oh, maybe just before your period, you can take it for a week, then you stop. That's very common way of treating PMS symptoms.
Yeah.
That's also how girls get put on the pill at the age of 13. It's like, oh, you've had your first period, you've got period pains, let's just dull down all your divinity so then you can't connect to anything or any other woman in the room. And you have no lessons, there's no like guidance or lessons when you start bleeding at school. Like when I think about how we were at school, everyone was just so ashamed of it. And like even the nurses and the teachers were just also like hush, 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 hush about it.
Yeah.
And I think like, that it doesn't help when you come out of certain mental states and you think like, oh, there's nothing that I can kind of go back to when I was connected to it.
Yeah.
Because it's an effort to be connected to it, that's for sure. It takes time, but when you do connect to it, there is so much happiness and connection in that. And explanation. A lot of explanation.
Yeah. I love this idea that the when we first start bleeding, it's like an initiation. It's like, what a beautiful reframing, that it's an initiation. Wow. And that perhaps pregnancy and miscarriage and abortion could be other forms of initiation, and then menopause is like the final initiation. It's like, wow, how far away we are in the way that we live, and how misogynist our culture, that we have so much shame and misunderstanding around our bleed.
She has a question.
Yes. Hey.
I think I'm struggling to understand how when a cycle is trying to reveal and illuminate something, I think I don't know if I can describe it as it's quite a noisy time in your life because you're trying to kind of mitigate a lot of the things that are kind of coming to the front. What you were speaking about, this notion of it revealing something, and if it's a weakness, but we're trying to refocus it. How do you take that noise, which could be positive and illuminating, and kind of rely on your cycle in a much more positive way? What are the kind of mechanisms or methods that you kind of, or processes that you could engage with beyond just listening? Because sometimes listening is also difficult, and you try to mitigate it with the junk that you refer to, Netflix, junk food, any sorts of gratification. So it'd be interesting to hear how.
I'm struggling if you don't give me like a concrete example though, that would help me. Can you think of something?
I guess akin to what this lady here shared about this notion of like if you have a family member who's kind of who irritated you earlier in the month, and that self-critic comes in 3 weeks later and you're like, why has this voice suddenly appeared in my head? I think sometimes those voices become, I shouldn't say voices, but like really what I'm talking about, like the monologue starts kicking in and you kind of start creating narratives, you start creating dialogues that have never existed in reality. How do you kind of quiet those down, those moments, by kind of relying on a more positive relationship with your cycle and a more positive relationship with the environment around you?
Whew. Yeah, I'm anyone else is welcome to respond as well. I mean, part of, just to say one thing, that part of the practice is to realize that a lot of the struggles that we experience, I think, have got to do with how much we are in our head and the thoughts and the sort of inner critic, the sort of self-sabotaging, the worries, the anxiety. And so one tool is this coming into the body, as simple as that, no? Just to stop identifying so much with our head. But I feel like there are so many different answers that I could give you, and I want to give really sort of concrete tools, but I'm not quite sure, like, for the example that you gave,
I guess, okay, I'll give you a more concrete example. Sometimes when I go to sleep at night, I find it really difficult. I have a very difficult relationship with sleeping as well, just in terms of cycles. That's another one. And often what I find lulls me to sleep is just I'll just listen to like conversations. Like I'll just put on some YouTube, doesn't even matter what it is, but I'll put that on just so I can be lulled to sleep, because those kind of external kind of conversations occurring around me kind of takes me out of my own head in a way, because sometimes, you know, the conversations from day to day can sometimes be a lot, and instead of trying to focus on them, I focus on that instead. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is there a way of kind of better connecting with your body and kind of the external environment?
Better than the external environment?
Well, no, better than maybe sometimes I and other people may be practicing that could better connect you, apart from just focusing on your body, which you've mentioned. Is there like, and then what, like, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to ask.
You guessed what, sorry?
I don't know what I'm trying to ask.
Maybe that's why I'm confused. Go on.
I just echo the word witnessing. So I think you witness what is happening, what you're doing, what's coming up. But you are doing that. What you described to us now is this, you can have that dialogue with yourself. I'm witnessing myself thinking, not able to disconnect from my head. You mentioned earlier, sort of in my head also. Bringing like this third person, just witnessing, maybe you detach yourself, maybe that's the dialogue then that you're listening to, instead of participating in the dialogue.
Hang on, what's going on? Is this in relation to that, or is this something else?
I say it's 50-50.
Okay. Would you like to hear another?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think changing my relationship to two things helped me sleep, falling asleep during my cycle. One of them is death, changing my relationship to death, and changing my relationship to the predator archetype. So I had
kind of linked to, I was vegetarian vegan for about 12 years, and came back to eating, not suggesting this, but I came back to eating meat very consciously and connecting with myself as a predator, myself in the cycle of having to kill other stuff to live and making peace with that, and I know it's not for everybody, and doing some shadow work around reclaiming my predator in my own psyche, and those two things help both with sleep and with the second part of the cycle. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Let's have one more thing, and then I want to talk a little bit more, and then we'll have a little break, and then go into more of a proper discussion later. So yeah, go for it.
For me, I had this similar thing with like sleeping and positivity. I noticed you used that word as well, and like in my experience, I used to have this like longing for always being positive, and I think for me it was like a bit like you said was witnessing. I came into presence, so rather than just clinging on to the idea of always being positive, I kind of moved away from that as an ideal, because I felt like being positive all of the time was kind of a reflection of society always being stuck in like summer or on, and that actually if I came into presence, that the negativity that I was feeling was actually like not necessarily negative at all. It was just that I wanted to be more silent or quiet or by myself, and I noticed like moving, sort of shifting my like longing for positivity to a longing for presence really helped me to come into like just noticing what was going on at that time, rather than fixating on like the sadness or the hurt or like something that was like allowing me to overthink or lay in bed with like loads of stuff going around my head, and I would just come into witnessing or presence. And something like kind of unrelated to this, but that's really, really been a massive tool in terms of coming into feeling, is ecstatic dance or 5 rhythms, so sober dancing, conscious dancing, and like it's completely like lifted me to a different place, because now there's a way I can connect with my body in a different way, along with things like yoga or something, if we're talking about like practical tools. But there was something about ecstatic dance that was just freeing in a really different way, and I noticed with my cycle how my body wants to move differently at different times of the month, and that presence as well in dance, where again when I started dancing and I was like, oh shit, I should always, you know, like dancing this way that's probably seductive for men, because I'm conditioned to think that if I'm in a club I should like be turning men or something, and like moving away from that to recognising how my body really wants to move, and that when I'm bleeding my body wants like really tender, like woomy kind of dance, and when I'm ovulating I'm like way more like sultry and seductive, and that's been something that I've found really fun as a way to come deeper into feeling, if you're looking for something like a tool to feel more.
Brilliant, thank you. Actually, I've just changed the structure in my mind. We'll just have a few more like questions or comments or discussion points, and then we'll go into a break, and then we'll sort of step back and look at the bigger implications, the bigger picture of everything. I think that would be a better flow. Yes.
It's fascinating stuff. I kind of lost my periods years ago due to kind of life situation being really tricky and kind of lifestyle at the time, and they never really came back. The odd one here and there, and then in the meantime I got older too, so I wasn't sure, you know, how I kind of lost it because of that. Then I would get like a token one at Christmas time, weirdly. Sometimes during Christmas Day, for the last few years, it's just been like, yeah, like a present. You know, and I really miss it. I really want it. I feel like there's something missing. I mean, obviously there is something missing. You know, apparently all my hormones are still kind of running, functioning fine, but I'm not having, you know, there's no evidence to kind of show that. And yeah, I don't know what my question is really, but I mean, I'd love to try and track. There is some sort of cycle going on, I know, because I feel things throughout the month, and often I'll just kind of put things down to hormones or whatever. But then that kind of feeling can last for way, way too long, and it can't be, you know, kind of anxiety lasts the whole month, and I'm thinking, possibly not. So yeah, it's just a weird one. I feel like quite a lot of loss over it, and I really want it back.
the day after I came from the doctors, I actually had a period just for like a day or two, which was just bingo, you know. And I felt it. I felt, you know, my body. I felt really sluggish. So I just totally embraced that feeling, which I don't often get anymore. And I guess, yeah, like how I would even start to track a cycle when there is no actual, you know, cycle there. But like you, I mean, I could be writing down how I feel.
Yeah.
But I'm not.
And then you just do it, and then you can look back on past charts, and then you can notice patterns, and you know, wouldn't it be so nice if, as soon as we start, or if we really start communicating with our wombs and it responds, wouldn't it be nice if that always happened? It does happen though. No, not always, but I've heard like amazing stories of deep connection with the womb and prayer, and yeah, the womb responding, and other stories about how bodies respond. And it, you know, it would just be so nice if you could say, well, it's always like that, or you know, there's some kind of assuredness in it, and there isn't. But the body is a magical thing and responds.
Try and get in a bit of a dialogue.
Exactly.
Come back.
I've heard so many stories that I have no doubt that we can dialogue with our bodies and they respond. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Just share a little bit of, since I started tracking and having a conversation, it's a dialogue, and sort of I started having with myself, but also with my world. So there's a sense of that we hide our blood, our bleed, we hide feelings around it, pain we hide with pills to help with, to organize ourselves. So as I started to have this dialogue with myself, I could also have it with my partner, with the world around me, and with just, with energies around me. So it sort of helped a lot with my confidence to sort of show up as I wanted to, really knows, because we talked a lot about it. There's a lot of things that I thought I was, because my self-critic was very strong. And as I started to see it, to see what's happening, and when sort of helped me place everything and say, okay, you belong here, or this is happening, that's okay, and this I really want, this I can let go, just this during the day, over the week, in a month, and so on. So that really changed a lot of how I relate. So it's really beautiful.
And you remind me of what I started saying, of this pattern that I've observed that begins with a lot of women sort of unpacking the PMT sort of time and inquiring into what's going on and what do I need in this time. And then the sort of spring of the cycle starting to sort of glow and want attention, and really questioning, like, what is my relationship to really showing up in the world? What is it like to be like unashamedly me? Wow, yeah. A lot to unpack.